Okay, so this week we're talking about, we're at our week two of our gender and economics discussion and reading group. As I mentioned last week, I'm working on preparing a full length 16-week course on gender and economics, and this is the offshoot of that. So I have syllabus and fertility is one of the subjects. This was the most attractive looking paper I felt of the group. And I think that this is a an excellent paper to discuss in a reading group. I think it's an excellent example. It's accessible. I think it's an excellent example for the younger students as well. Um, and that's because the methods are sufficiently complex to make it a good paper, but not sufficiently complex that it makes it beyond the understanding of newer students. Okay, so we're talking about fertility this week, and we're talking about the intersection of fertility and economics. Um, Fertility is a very important aspect of economic decision making at the household level. It is um, it is both um, it is both a social issue, as this paper captures a social question, and an economic question, because households, couples, mothers are considering not only what their preferences are for having children, that are influenced by social tastes and by their own preferences, but also what is the economic reality in which they live, um, which is also you know um, an important determinant because kids cost money. So that's part of the analysis here. And there's a long tradition in especially in development economics, of analyzing fertility issues. I think it's important to mention that there is this pervasive racist trope about poor people kind of popping out babies. And I want, maybe you guys can, if you listen to me now, then like if you see this out in the wild, you can name it and call it out. But like there's this idea that poor people just pop out babies and that all those countries are overpopulated. And I even heard this the other day, and all those countries are overpopulated and it's causing some burden on the world. But that's not really true. We don't have any reason to think that anywhere is becoming overpopulated. I don't believe. You can check the data, check the literature. And as we find in this paper, the income effects are small on fertility, at least in Israel, were small, and there was an inverted U shape, as the finding is in this paper, where at the bottom of the income spectrum, you have a lower income leads to having more babies. Then as you go through the middle, it dips down, and as you get to the top of the income spectrum again, then higher income leads to having more babies in the family. So the idea that it could be different in Africa or it could be different in Southeast Asia where customs and cultures are different. But as Angus Deaton talks about in his book, that's a very pervasive sort of Malthusian, based on Malthus, like kind of like ideology. They mention Malthus here. The other touching off point, or one of the most recent touching off points for this, who laid the theoretical foundations for this paper, was Gary Becker. I don't remember if we talked about him last week, but he's one of the most important economists at the intersection of sociology and economics, and he is a Nobel laureate. And if you don't know Gary Becker, you should learn all about him because he's awesome. Um, and Becker said that children should be uh, considered as consumption and production goods. But let me just get back to this last point here on this slide. So, what I would like us all to think about while we're going through this evidence today and this paper today is, how do these decisions aggregate up in the macro sense? Because we're going to look at micro data today, but I think we can all very easily imagine, what are the important macroeconomic implications of fertility? We've all seen a solo model. We've all seen a stable, I hope we've all seen something like that, a macro model with a stable growth path. And I think we should all know, or you should know, that population is an important feeder into economic growth. And that's also related to the amount of human capital in the economy, which is correlated with the amount of people that you have. Ideas, human capital, brain capital. Okay, so yeah, as I mentioned, fertility is an important. I covered a lot of these points already. Fertility is an important life cycle decision. You know, um, a woman in her lifetime is only going to decide so many times whether she wants to have a baby. So there's a sort of upper bound on how many babies a woman can have. I think that increases the intensity of the decision making around this. And then there's a lot of social pressures about it. And as I said, this paper is a good illustration of that because we have quite distinct and different religious groups in Israel with distinct traditions. Um, and then this is something that I don't touch on. We don't touch on in this paper, but I feel as a development economist, I should mention that a lot of this literature is also about contraception in the development literature and empowering women to be able to decide for themselves when or if they want to get pregnant. And that's really important. It also it's important with respect to women's empowerment because it raises the ability of a woman to walk away from a relationship. She can say no to the pregnancy. She has more agency that way, and that's the dimension that's really important. So we don't talk about that a lot this week, but it's something to think about. Okay, now let's talk about this paper, which is this awesome paper, Financial Incentives in Fertility, from the Review of Economics and Statistics, Alma Cohen, Rajiv Degia, and Dmitry Romanov. From 2013. Restat is a really, really, really good journal. So it's not like top on the top tier, but I would say just below. And no reason, nothing bad to say about Restat for sure. This is an excellent journal and an excellent publication. And this is crazy good data. I think that the story of this paper and one of the things that you can take away from this paper is more than having fancy econometrics and even maybe more than having good ideas, having good data can lead to good ideas and lead to good analysis. And that's kind of a lot of the time how the direction goes, in terms of workflow and doing research. You start with the data. Most economists don't get to go out and make their own data and collect their own data in the world. Most economists work with observational data. But this is a nice concept as well. I think they thought it through, and I think they developed it. They did the instrumental variables. I'm not going to go through all the robustness checks, but they did nice instrumental variables. They did the robustness checks. It was very thorough. And the instrumental variables, that was clever that they did that. I'm probably not going to talk that much about that unless someone really wants to get into it. But they controlled for the simultaneity of income and fertility, which could be endogenous, right? You're deciding how many babies to have based on what your level of income is. As I said, this covers many different ethnicities, and I'm going to get to that more when we're looking at the tables from the paper. This is a linear probability model that they use, and I was having a little bit discussion about that with Delusional, and he was kind of implying that maybe a little bit linear probability model is a bad, but in my opinion, and from what I've been taught, that linear probability model, in general, people would say some people might say if you have a probability situation, you should always use a probit model, they would feel. But probit's inefficient, and it's important to remember that. And using OLS may not necessarily be a bad fit. So this isn't the most technical description, but as far as I know, LPM is a good first cut. And if you don't have any other reason to use probit, like explicit reason that you've seen or you think is a good reason, it's better to use LPM because it's more efficient. So they did use LPM here. So this is just OLS, basically. And when they say non-parametric, what they mean is that they did a set of interactions. Okay, but that's the higher level stuff. Okay. So this builds on that work that Gary Becker laid down. And Gary Becker said that children are both a durable good, investment good, and a consumption good. Then if children are an economic good, then it stands that economic factors should also influence women or a couple's choices about fertility. And then the main findings about the paper are that the subsidy does positively affect women's fertility, and they have a nice measure, and we're going to talk about that in a second. And then I believe the paper gets identification only from mothers who are between their third and fourth child. So the mothers who are in the survey have to have had at least 2 children in order to be included in their analysis. And then the reason for that is as follows, I don't remember what exactly they say for their explanation, but for me, it's really different, the decision about the first child. There's a lot more factors going into that. And it could conflate the subsidy with social factors, or it could make identification of the effect of the subsidy more difficult. And that's why they use this third and fourth child. And it seems like they also picked a very specific period to use also. So here, I put this here. So the period that they chose to study was 1999 to 2005. And the reason that they like this period, maybe there were other periods they could have used, okay? The reason that they like this period is that there is significant variation in the subsidy during this period, but not on the eligibility criteria. So basically what you're talking about here is ceteris paribus. How does our ceteris paribus look? Does it look good or does it look suspicious? And in this case, it looks good because the eligibility requirements aren't changing, but the value of the subsidy is changing. And as we know from econometrics, we want that variation because we want to measure the effect of that variation on the dependent variable. If there's no variation in your regressor, you can't estimate any effect on the dependent variable. And then the subsidy here is equivalent to $34. So it's Israeli shekels 150, but just so that you guys can think about it in dollars. Okay, we're going to get more nitty and gritty this week. So this is the estimated expression. And I'm going to try and help you make sense of it. So the subsidy is the delta, which is the main parameter of interest here. That's right here. Okay. And the child subsidy for family or household I and time T. Households indexed by I and time is indexed by T. And this expression here, which is the nastier looking one, this is like an indicator function for how many previous kids they had. So it's like conditioned on how many children the household previously had. So if it had 2 previous children or 3 previous children, that's being included as a control variable as well. And then this is the age range of the previous children. So they broke it into groups like children, like, let me tell you what they are. 0 and 4, 5 and 13, 14 and 17, and over 18. So they're testing to see if there's some effects of, like if you have 2 12-year-old twins versus having one 12-year-old and one 2-year-old, does that have a differential effect on your fertility? These are the rest of the control. This is how it always is going to be also. So this is a good example anyway. This is the rest of the controls, which they just put here. They just chucked here and they gave you fee for those. And this is the religious dummy variables for the religion, and we're going to see that in a minute. Okay, one last point. Maybe one of the more important points for those of you who are into econometrics. In this case, they clustered the standard errors at the year times number of children times age distribution of the children. They multiplied a cluster of those 3 things. And what they're doing for that reason, this is structuring the error term. This is going to be a little bit like of a bootleg explanation, but I'm going to do my best. So they clustered the standard errors at the level that the child subsidy was distributed. So I think that's at the household. This is it was conditioned. The subsidy was conditioned on the number of children and the ages of your children. So, and that changed over year. So the reason that they clustered the standard errors is that's the reason they clustered the standard errors at that level. That's the kind of rule of thumb that they're following, the heuristic that they're following here. They clustered the standard errors, and that means that the estimates for the standard errors use the entire sample from that period. And that means the interpretation of that is that shocks are common to that group. We're controlling for common shocks by clustering the standard errors at that level. Okay, we can come back to questions if you have more questions about that. Voila, voila. We all want to see the tables. Bring me the tables. Here's the first table. This is the main result table. I skipped the summary statistics table, and I put in a giant red box the parameter of interest so that it will be easy for interpretation. So the stars here, they meet 3 means statistically significant at the 0.01 alpha level. 2 is statistically significant at the alpha 0.05, and 1 star, this is standard 0.1 level. So this is statistically significant at the highest level, but it's a bit difficult to interpret because the magnitude is weird. It doesn't look like it's doing much in terms of the magnitude. So let's keep going, okay? But we also see that all of these religious dummies are significant as well. And this age at first birth is all significant. I didn't even include the second. I thought I included the second half, but I didn't include the second half of this table. But this column is using 1.2 million observations. This column is using 1.2. All of them are using 1.2. There's 1.2 million observations used in each regression. So you can understand why they just did whatever sets of dummies and multipliers of those dummies that they wanted, because they had they had so many observations that it was easy to do. Okay, so this is one of the tables that I found the most interesting. I didn't include all the tables. But this is one of the tables that I found the most interesting, which was the effect by income level. and we can see that among the lower, right here, can you see what I'm pointing at? Anyway, okay, cool, all right. This is the poor ones. This is the non-poor, and then this is the wealthy ones. If you want to think of it that way, for the poorest, the subsidy has the largest effect. We compare straight across this row here, and these are the parameter estimates. And so we say so the way that we would interpret this would be for a 1 percentage point increase in this, or for a 1 unit increase, excuse me, for a 1 unit increase or $34 increase in the subsidy, the probability of having a child will increase by 0.97%. So it's almost 1-to-1 in terms of percent. So we also see, except for the ultra-Orthodox Jewish, we see that the effects are differential across the religious groups. They have such a large sample; they can do this. It's awesome. They're so blessed to have amazing data with 1.2 million observations. That's some Raj Chetty data. Okay, so they have, and then in the secular Jewish, for example, it's kind of lower, and then in the Orthodox Jewish, it's a little higher, and then among the Muslim families, it's the highest. So if you were a policymaker and you were trying to maximize fertility in the country, which group would you pay the subsidy to? Or which two groups? I'm just kidding, but it's pretty obvious, right? Definitely the Orthodox Jewish and the Muslim group. Okay, then I also include this Table 6, which is showing the differential effects by mother's age. This is normal to do in a paper. If any of you guys are going to do research, you're going to do, and especially if you have a larger sample, you're going to be doing exactly the same thing, splitting the sample into these different categories and running the analysis the same, and seeing how the results turn out. But we have the groupings here and the same parameter estimates across the difference. So we see that the smallest effect, and it's not statistically significant at traditional levels of significance for women older than 40. And for women, that has the largest effect between women 30 and 35. So maybe if we were policymakers and we wanted to implement, our own policy in our own country based off of this, and we thought that our population was very similar to Israel, of course, then we might target women 25 to 35 especially, and avoid women younger than 25 and women 35 and up. But there's some ethical questions about that too, so I'm not getting to that, but definitely there would be. Okay. So then that's really all I have. I'm curious if you guys have any questions. So in the end, they also do, let me just mention, they run through the analysis again, and they instrument for education with past education they have some instruments that they use for the level of education, and they use that as a robustness check, and it doesn't change the results. It doesn't change the results substantially. So that's why I didn't go into it. If they were different and there were some interesting differences, I would have mentioned it. They have some alternative models of expectation formation. So that was very interesting in my opinion as well, which they say that because the value of the subsidy was changing, it was women's expected future value of the subsidy that they would make their decision based on. And they ran some analysis this way using an AR1 model, which they say that this is like modeling adaptive expectations. So the women are projecting their future, they're imagining the future value themselves, they're estimating in their own mind the future value of the subsidy, and then making choices based on that. And they got some interesting results out of that, but again, it was largely the same outcome. And those are the graphs. That's what's in the graphs. But I wasn't worried that I wouldn't be able to explain them well, so I didn't include very well, so I didn't include it. Oh, and then last, we have the income effects. So that's one of the most interesting parts. I wish that I'd included one of those tables, but they have the income effects, which is also building on Becker's work, where he says that there should be income effects, but they should be small. 16, yeah, 16. Basically, what they do is they control, and 15 as well. So basically what they do is they just include income as a control variable in the regression. This is here actually, sorry, this is actually right here. It's controlling for income as well. You see there. And so the income effects, are negative at the lower level, and then at between the 30 and 40 range, not statistically significant, and then again older than 40, the income effects are negative again. That's not across the income spectrum, but that's across the age spectrum. Sorry. Um, and they mentioned the costs, the average costs to of a child as well. Yeah, sure. They're not more significant or less significant. They're just larger in magnitude. Yeah, they talk a little bit about the social reasons, but they don't. It's not a sociology paper, so. And also, we can imagine that, like, if we were thinking about external validity a bit, because that's important, we could imagine that Muslims in Israel might be different from Muslims in Tunisia, right, or Sudan. So, this doesn't necessarily mean that all Muslims are going to have this. This is going to effect is going to hold through all of time on all Muslims, for example. Yeah, how do you deal with weighting the social? So for me, there's a function that puts some weight on the social question and some weight on the economic part of the question. And for me, there's some range in between there where people are like thinking more strategically and economically about having babies, and then other people who are just like, I want to have a baby. I'll figure out the rest later. And I think there's both types of people from what I've seen. Anyway, that's all I've got. If anybody has any other specific questions, or we could talk about the instrumentation strategy, but uh, I think this was a very clean paper. There's a lot of tables. It's a little tedious. I might have put the instrumental variables tables in the back if they didn't show anything differential. Um, but yeah, unless